everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I would like to talk to you about 3 books that have made me so exceptionally happy. They are sort of tied together, though a little bit loosely. I would like to present to you Ahab's Rolling Sea, Naming Nature, and The Fossil Hunter. And as I talk about these, you'll see that the running thread is Victorian period, naturalism, but natural history that has to do with the ocean, the sea, and sea exploration, or the coast, fossils, and dinosaurs. I am going to start with my absolute favorite, which is Ahab's Rolling Sea. This is A Natural History of Moby Dick by Richard J. King. Exactly as the title suggests, this book is a very close reading of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. It is superb. This book is everything that I ever wanted in a nonfiction book. Not only is it doing close reading of Moby Dick, and it looks at contemporary literary figures, things that Melville would have drawn on at the time, things that would have inspired him, but it also looks at historical context. He looks at Owen Chase's account of the shipwreck of the whale ship Essex, which you would find out more about in a book like The Heart of the Sea. He draws on the context of the time, but then he will take you chapter by chapter. And on this adventure with Ishmael, whenever we come across anything in the natural realm, he pauses and he will then talk to you about that animal and everything we know about it now, but what would have been known at the time about this animal. And it really forces you to think about what science looked like in the Victorian period and what limited knowledge people would have had, but also limited vocabulary. Because this book, Moby Dick, not this one, but Moby Dick came out in 1851. Darwin's Origin of Species came out in 1859. So there was a lot of language barrier that didn't cut it or didn't make it into the book. But then it's even more admirable about what Melville does with the natural world, with that limited knowledge of the time and how it still stands. I really like the way King talks about Melville's relationship to other writers, things that he would have read. So for example, when we get to the part about the albatross or the bird, he takes a pause and talks about Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. He'll talk about the symbolism of the albatross and how it made it into different literature of the time. And prior to that, he looks at Dana's account of 2 years before the mast, which came out a decade prior to Moby Dick. Books that would have circulated around Melville's time. And then, of course, we get into the whales and everything out at sea. We also look at some of Melville's travels and what he could have gotten from his journeys. He does talk a lot about the difference between, being the scientist that Darwin was and going on these journeys to observe certain things versus being out at sea just as a casual passenger, and the differences between someone like Melville and someone like Darwin. So there is also a chart of all of the figures and natural historians and literary figures of the time. I will put a picture of it here on the screen so you can see. But the majority of this book does look at whales. Whales in their historical context, again, being used for oil at the time. But it will also talk more about the natural realm, like you have hurricanes or typhoons and how that would affect the whaling industry. I do not mean to diminish this book in any way by oversimplifying it, but to me it kind of reads like one of those rap genius analysis where you have a song and then almost every single sentence branches out into references and context and books, information, nonfiction, fiction. All of that is in here. So I would, if I had the power to make a reading syllabus for people interested in Moby Dick and Herman Melville, I would make this kind of a supplement reading to Moby Dick, and I think it would benefit students greatly. So if you're currently reading Moby Dick, or you are interested in that book, or want to know more about it and just nerd out over it in some way, I think this book is extraordinary. It's definitely going to be among my absolute favorite nonfiction books of all time. I've enjoyed every second of it. I'm in awe, and I really love learning about natural history and the ocean, so this is just like a perfect amalgamation of all the things I love. Now I'm going to read to you a sentence from this book which leads us into the next book. Now that sentence is found on page 45, and he writes, I appreciate Melville's frustration with the taxonomy business, especially in an age before Origin of Species, when species were considered static and designed perfectly by God. My point here is that you have to cut an educated Christian sailor like Ishmael some slack here for his skepticism of the classification systems for whales. And reading through this book, and that sentence in particular, reminded me of a book that I read in undergrad for an essay on Darwin and language. One of the things that not a lot of people know is that the word evolution wasn't really used until the 6th edition, I think, of Origin of Species. And prior to that, he would use words like transmutation. The naming of the natural world was a whole task on its own because you have so many species and subspecies and animals all over the world, and you have to deal with their colloquial folk language versus the standard academic Latin one. So this task was first taken on by Linnaeus. And the book that I'm going to talk about is Naming Nature, The Clash Between Instinct and Science by Carol June. I have mentioned this book a little bit in a video I made on books about fun with words, or if you like language. But this book is primarily about science and the natural world and the idea of taxonomy in general, how difficult of a task it is to organize the living world in a way that makes sense. So this book begins by looking at Linnaeus and his very military style organization system. He did have an opinion on the natural world when it came to hierarchy, and he looked at things like starting from the top and going down the bottom chain, things being better than others, and also there being an order in conversation with religion and God, and how all of this sort of shifted linguistically when you have Darwin entering the conversation and now looking at a web of life and transmutation. But this book is so much more than that. It doesn't stop at Darwin. It keeps going with more contemporary scientists, and it looks at chemistry as well, and how chemistry and elements also work on taxonomy when it comes to labeling the natural world. Throughout all of the newer chapters as well, it ties it back to Linnaeus and Darwin. It keeps going back to its origins, and it just really makes you consider the difficulties of naming the natural world. Now, the third book that I'm going to mention is The Fossil Hunter. This is a book written by Shelley Emling. This is a book about the mother of paleontology, Mary Anning. So Mary Anning lived between the late 1700s and mid 1800s in the Lyme Regis area in England. In 1811, she found an ichthyosaurus, or the skull of one, and then found the rest. And she's kind of accredited for that discovery first and foremost. But her interest in fossils started way before that. She really liked going by the shore with her father when she was little, and he taught her how to find fossils and to identify rocks that might contain fossils inside. This kind of became a side hustle for her. It was a way to make money because people were very interested in fossils at the time. But she was also very scientifically curious. She was interested in these things. She would do drawings. She would try to write scientific papers on it. And she was very much rejected by the scientific community because she was a woman. A lot of men took credit for her discoveries and her works, especially at the beginning. Over time, she did receive some of the credit that she deserved. And now, I think, even more so as people are collecting women from the margins of history, a lot more books and movies and documentaries have been created focusing on Mary Anning. I'm personally in awe of just the time period that she lived in and the difficulties for women at the time. One figure in this book that kind of breaks your heart is her mother, who had 10 children, out of which only 2 survived. And just again, thinking only of like going through pregnancy and labor and postpartum with 10 children, to survive 8 of them so early on is just a kind of grief that I couldn't even imagine. This book also made me go to the museum at least twice since starting it. I've been looking a lot more closely at bones and fossils and trying to appreciate them for what I've read about them in this book. But most importantly, I was able to find at our local museum an ichthyosaurus, And this one was found in Ontario, I think, or somewhere in Canada. It's a Canadian ichthyosaur, and it's a lot smaller. But the one she found is much bigger. But another thing that this book mentions, which is something I did not consider, and I think it ties back to the other two books, is that prior to the world as a whole being able to accept the idea of evolution, there were some other steps before that. They didn't just go from believing that there's an ultimate creation God and this idea of evolution or transmutation. The middle step, which is brought up in this book, especially when it has to do with dinosaurs, is that they had to accept the idea of an extinction. Because it also meant that, you know, things could just completely disappear, and just because God created it doesn't mean it gets to stay in existence. That kind of logic shift between before and after is just something I've never considered as a separate idea in this scientific progress, and how small these steps were. So if you are looking for a fictionalized account of Mary Anning, there are two novels that I'm going to show you briefly. So this one is by Tracy Chevalier. It's called Remarkable Creatures. Again, this is a novel. Some of its covers look a little bit like this. I'm going to put it on the screen. I think that one's a bit more popular. And the second book is called Curiosity, a novel by Joan Thomas. These books came out in 2010 and 2011, and currently there's a little bit of interest in Mary Anning. A few years ago, a movie came out called Ammonite, where Kate Winslet plays Mary Anning, and she did an amazing job, though I would have really preferred if there was at least 20 or 30 minutes in the movie just talking about dinosaurs. I really wish they focused more on her scientific and curious mind rather than the potential fictionalized relationships she might have had and what she might have said to them. It would have been a lot cooler to learn more about the dinosaurs, but maybe the movie that comes out this year about her, which I think is a documentary, I'm not entirely sure, but I am very much looking forward to it. I'll put it on the screen. I don't know if it's been released in certain places, but I wasn't able to find it just yet. But as soon as I'm able to stream it somewhere, I'm definitely going to watch it. Another one that I've heard was loosely based on the life of Mary Anning was The Essex Serpent. And there's both the book and the TV show. I personally didn't love it. It just reminds me a little bit of a kind of, you know, natural history. Mary Anning meets the witch hunts and the Crucible. I don't know, maybe that's a bit of a stretch. But if you are interested in these, I'm gonna put together this bundle for you and link things down below if you want to take a look. So that's been my adventure with fossils and dinosaurs and natural history when it has to do with the ocean. If you know of any other works, please let me know, because I'd love to read more about this, especially if you find something similar to the King book, where it's a tie-in with a literary work and natural history, because I love the combination of fiction and nonfiction kind of merged into one, and close reading, because it makes me feel like I'm talking to a friend about a book and learning along the way. So thank you very much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Bye!